Assalamu alaikum, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to the Rican Muslim. I'm your host, Rican Muslim. So, if we want to know why Africa is in the state as it is, really, we don't need to look further than the West and the US. And we'll show you why in this video. So, let's begin.
The U.S. prides itself on being the champion of democracy, justice, and freedom. But the reality is far different from what it portrays. History has shown how the U.S. is all about protecting its interests. And it will do anything, including suppressing other nations, inciting wars, and even carrying out assassination attacks to protect this interest. One region that has been the recipient of these U.S. policies is Africa. For decades, whenever people talk about the injustice suffered by Africa, all eyes point to Europe. While that is true, the fact is that the U.S. has also perpetrated a lot of injustice, all in a bid to protect its interest. This is why in this video, we will show you a chronicle of how some U.S. president has created chaos in the African continent. We are going to start with the 34th President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who became the first ever U.S. president to order the assassination of a foreign leader. This foreign leader was none other than the first Prime Minister of Congo, the infamous Patrice Lumumba.
Wind blowing through the Belgian Congo, and down comes the Belgian flag in Leopoldville, a few days in fact in advance of independence. Elected as Prime Minister of the new Congo Republic, Mr. Patrice Lumumba receives congratulations from members of both Houses of Parliament.
It all began in June 1960 when Congo gained independence from Belgium's colonial rule. Unfortunately, within days, the African rank of the Congolese army mutinied due to the fact that despite independence, they remained under the leadership of a notorious Belgian leader, Emile Janssens. In response, Belgian troops landed in Katanga, a province in Congo notable for its rich mineral resources. The Belgians were welcomed by Tshombe, the most important and wealthy politician in the province, who Malcolm X once referred to as the worst African ever born. You see, Tshombe was a strong supporter of the Belgians and enjoyed the benefits that came with it. So, not only did he personally welcome the Belgian troops, but with their help declared Katanga an independent state, thereby throwing the newly former Congo into chaos. Within months, Belgian troops in Katanga advanced towards the capital of Congo. They took over the airfields and gave Patrice Lumumba orders about where he was allowed to travel. In simple terms, Congo was in chaos. At first, Lumumba requested assistance in the form of international troops from the UN, which they provided. But it wasn't the help that Lumumba wanted. Instead of using the force to subdue Katanga and bring order into Congo, the leader of the UN force did nothing of such, thereby allowing Tshombe's breakaway regime to further establish itself with Belgian help. In fact, when the UN force entered Congo, they bypassed the capital where Lumumba was and went directly to Katanga to meet Tshombe. This made Lumumba angry and made him realize that the UN would not be of help. In desperation, he turned to the Soviets for help. They agreed, but their military force was meager. However, it was this decision that led to his assassination. How association with the Soviets angered the US, and they branded him a communist. In July 1960, Patrice Lumumba traveled to the US in an attempt to seek help. However, the visit was a disaster. He was not well received according to diplomatic dictate, and most of the US politicians regarded him as an erratic and unpredictable leader. Meanwhile, the CIA had already begun to raise concerns about communist influence. But from every indication, Lumumba was not a communist. In August 1960, during a cabinet meeting, President Eisenhower made the decision to remove Lumumba because he didn't want to offend Belgium, an ally of NATO. So the CIA set up a plan to assassinate Lumumba with the help of Tshombe and the notorious Mobutu. Interestingly, the UN had no objections to his assassination. Within the next few months, Lumumba's assassination plan began to play out. His wife was denied access to medical care and gave birth prematurely to a daughter who died. He was arrested twice by Mobutu with the backing of the CIA. In January 1961, Mobutu flew a captive Lumumba to Katanga, where Tshombe and his Belgian associate beat him for hours. By the time they were done, Tshombe was covered with Lumumba's blood. Afterwards, Lumumba was driven to a remote area and murdered along with 2 members of his political party. After the men were dead, the killers poured sulfuric acid to dissolve the bodies. They did this to prevent it from becoming a symbol of resistance. What a tragic end for the enigmatic ruler. After his
Yeah, and we see it. We see it over and over again. You know, the US won't send any help. The UN won't help. Europe won't help. And when the only help they can get was from Russia, oh, he's a communist. And you know what? That means freedom. That's what it means on it. Even though they completely made themselves independent, oh, European countries like, no, actually, we own you. We own you, blacks, right? And of course, everybody's okay with that. You know, of course, with Russia pretty much did the same thing. Oh no, that's evil. It's just the hypocrisy is always seen when it comes to black and brown people. And at this stage, to still believe that the hypocrisy is not real, it's just dumb. It's like you have to be living under a rock.
his death, Congo was plunged into chaos and infighting for the next 4 years until Mobutu took the reins of leadership with the support of the US and the UN. Mobutu went on to rule Congo ruthlessly for the next 3 decades. So not only did the US assassinate an African leader, but it also helped to install one that will go down in history as one of the most corrupt and ruthless African leaders.
And to be completely honest, the US is okay with that. Black lives don't matter in the US, especially in Africa itself. And pretty sure they applauded themselves. Most, not all US presidents, not only are they racist, but they're soulless individuals, care nothing for actual lives whatsoever. And we see this play out numerous times, but people still deny it.
Next US leader we want to talk about is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was America's 37th president, and his African policy was shaped by Cold War geopolitics. This meant advocating for pro-Western stability at all costs. However, this policy directly harmed African nations fighting for independence. Throughout his term, President Nixon provided support for pro-Western African leadership and crushed those who attempted to change things. In South Africa, the Nixon administration supported the white racist apartheid regime, providing both economic and diplomatic support. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this.
More than once.
This support ensured that the apartheid regime thrived. The forced removal of black South Africans from their homes and the oppressive rule of the white minority continued. President Nixon did this to ensure that South Africa remained an ally of the US and that the US had continued access to gold, diamond, and uranium reserves. But beyond South Africa, Nixon fully supported Mobutu's ruthless and dictatorial regime. Mobutu received massive financial and military aid from Nixon, which he used to oppress the people and enrich himself. Nixon also provided support for Portugal's brutal colonial rule in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, where African independent movements were crushed with US-backed weapons and logistics. In 1975, when Angola was on the verge of gaining independence from Portugal, Nixon's administration began to secretly fund and arm Jonas Savimbi's rebels, plunging Angola into a 27-year civil war. This war killed thousands and left Angola in ruins for years. President Nixon did this simply to counter the Soviet Union's influence. So it can be rightly concluded that President Nixon chose to support dictators over true democracy in Africa simply to promote Western dominance. Now,
yeah, it's just, and we're supposed to be patriotic about this, right? We're supposed to like, yay, US, like, you know, we're okay, like we support dictators. As long as we like the dictators, or as long as the dictators say, you know, oh, we're US. As long as the dictators are, you know, are okay with the US, they like the US, they're willing to literally lick the boots of the US, we will support them to the very end. We will support any genocide, any killing, anything at all. We will support them to that. If they want to hang little babies and eat them, we will support them. As long as they say thumbs up to the US. And talk about Western values. Western values. These are Western values.
Now, just like President Nixon, the next president on this list openly supported the apartheid regime in South Africa. We are talking about America's 40th president, Ronald Reagan. He followed the footsteps of his predecessor, President Nixon, in supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa and the rebel forces in Angola. In South Africa, Reagan defended the racist white minority and even referred to Nelson Mandela and the ANC party as terrorists. Reagan's administration called this policy towards South Africa constructive engagement. They maintained support for the regime under the excuse of maintaining stability and countering Soviet influence. In Angola, Reagan continued to provide military support for the UNITA rebel group responsible for committing mass atrocities, including massacres and the use of child soldiers. Under Reagan, the CIA funnels funds and weapons to the rebels in a war that lasted until 2002 and led to the death of over 500,000 Angolas. The rebels targeted schools and hospitals and left millions displaced from their homes. In Mozambique, Reagan supported the notorious Renamo insurgents who terrorized civilians. They beheaded, raped, and engaged in mass killings. The Renamo insurgents were used as a tool to weaken the socialist government of Mozambique, which had an alliance with the Soviets. This insurgency led to the death of over 1 million people and many more displaced. Finally, it was Reagan's administration that set the groundwork for the establishment of the U.S. military presence in Africa with the establishment of several military bases. These bases, though portrayed as U.S. efforts toward counterterrorism, in reality, was created to protect U.S. interests in Africa. The 42nd U.S.
Before we continue, when you wonder why we're supporting an apartheid state in Gaza, this is why. This is why. The U.S. and their presidents literally do not care about black and brown lives. Forget about being systemic. This is something they have no problem with slavery. It's just done a different way. They'll just enslave an entire country. Because if they're all slaves, everybody's okay with it. As long as it's not at home. It's not, as long as it's kind of far away. But they have no problem with South Africa. Mandela was a terrorist. Yet he won a Nobel Prize for peace, became the president. They made a documentary about him, heralded him as being just a great man, while the U.S. called him a terrorist, and had him on a terrorist watch list, had no support. Again, the only people that will support him was Russia, Cuba, and some of these places. Because the U.S. does not want to see them free. They want them to be slaves. They just have to do it a little bit different. They like slavery. The West loves slavery. They just had to find a way to do it differently. And so-called Christians are okay with it. They're okay with it. They follow through along with it. They applaud it and everything. They put their heads in the sand so they can pretend they don't know what's going on. And again, why don't you follow Western? Why don't you okay Western values and all this nonsense? Oh, that's why. That's why I'm not for favor. This, so back with Christianity and all that. So no, I don't want anything to do with it.
President Bill Clinton took after his predecessors in causing chaos in the African continent. One such instance was his refusal to intervene during the 1994 Rwanda genocide. The Rwandan genocide led to the death of about 800 to 1 million Tutsi in just 100 days. The interesting thing is that the U.S. government had intelligence on the escalating violence even before the mass killings escalated. Intelligence reports obtained using the U.S. Freedom of Information Act show the cabinet and almost certainly the president had been told of a planned final solution to eliminate all Tutsis before the slaughter reached its peak. But that's not all. Clinton's administration also blocked all efforts to send international peacekeeping efforts. In fact, Clinton ordered the United Nations to withdraw its troops, giving the genocidal militias free rein to commit massacres. Later, the U.S. would say that the reason the administration did not intervene was because they did not want to repeat the fiasco of U.S. intervention in Somalia, where U.S. troops became sucked into fighting. But that was far from the truth. The truth was that the Clinton administration had no interest in Rwanda, a small Central African country with no minerals or strategic value. So, there were no valuable resources for the U.S. to exploit. As such, the U.S. decided not to intervene. 4 years after this, the Clinton administration intervened in Sudan in 1998. This was after the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were attacked by terrorists. In response to these attacks, Clinton ordered a missile strike on a pharmaceutical company in Khartoum, Sudan, claiming it was producing chemical weapons for terrorists. Unfortunately, it turned out to be false information. The pharmaceutical factory was actually Sudan's biggest producer of life-saving medicines, including antibiotics and vaccines. The destruction of the factory led to severe medical shortages and an increase in preventable deaths from malaria and other treatable diseases. According to humanitarian organizations, tens of thousands of Sudanese people died as a result of this reckless bombing. Interestingly, Clinton never issued an apology or even offered compensation. His administration left Sudan to deal with the aftermath of the attack alone. The next president on this list is off.
You guys heard this, right? I mean, this is true. Freedom of information, all of this is true. This is the US. This is the real US right there. And if you think that that was a mistake, it wasn't. It was literally made so there will be deaths. That bombing was so they would die. They wanted the death. They did. That's why. We don't just oopsie. No. There was a reason for it. They wanted the death, and there we go. They enjoy this. These presidents enjoy this. They really do enjoy this. They like it. They like to see that. They see the control. They're not people. They're not humans for them. It's how the US sees it. They're not human.
Often credited for launching HIV/AIDS relief efforts in Africa. However, his overall impact on the continent was stained with chaos and destabilization. This president is none other than George Bush, who stepped in after Bill Clinton left office. President Bush's policy in Africa centered around military expansion, particularly direct military intervention in Somalia. Bush's administration marked the beginning of U.S. militarization of the African continent, where under the guise of counterterrorism efforts, the U.S. advanced its geopolitical and economic interests. In 2007, President Bush created a separate military organization that would answer directly to the U.S. government when it became obvious that Africa's geostrategic significance was on the rise and the U.S. influence was on the decline. With the help of AFRICOM, the U.S. was able to place American forces on strategic African nations that had valuable land and sea resources. Under the pretext of counterterrorism efforts, the Bush administration was able to use AFRICOM to create situations that aligned with its interests. However, this led to long-term instability, internal conflict, and the erosion of national sovereignty. One of the most destructive actions undertaken under President Bush was the 2006 invasion of Somalia. During this period, the U.S. supported Ethiopian military forces to overthrow the Islamic Court Union, a political movement that had brought a sense of stability to Somalia for years. However, the Bush administration falsely labeled the ICU a terrorist organization, claiming that it was linked to terrorists despite evidence to the contrary. With the backing of the U.S., Ethiopian troops invaded Somalia, leading to the death of thousands of civilians and the displacement of many. Interestingly, the invasion backfired. It created instability and an opportunity for the notorious terrorist group Al-Shabaab to grow in the country. Till today, the country of Somalia remains unstable, with different rebel factions fighting for power. Meanwhile, the terrorist group continues to terrorize Somalia and neighboring countries. Similar situations occurred in the Sahel region. The U.S. counterterrorism efforts in Mali and Niger did nothing to reduce the terrorism. Instead, it fueled the tensions and caused strife and internal conflict. Additionally, Bush was a strong proponent of the IMF and World Bank neoliberal policies, which forced African countries to accept crippling loans in exchange for opening their markets to Western corporations and companies which desired access to cheap resources. These policies did not just place African countries in sinking debts which they have not been able to come out of, but also affected ordinary Africans. Expenditures on public health services, education, and infrastructures were cut. In addition, these policies ensured that African countries remained exporters of raw materials.
Yep. Yeah, Mr. Born-again Christian Bush. That's what he did. That's what he did. And the US has done plenty of that. You know, the terrorist organization. That's all they have to do. They just frame it and then boom, it's time to instill democracy. Sure. And we had a group that was there that was stable, stabilizing the country. People were safe and growing. We have to make sure that more people die. And that's what he did. That's exactly what he did. No proof or nothing, but then again, we don't need proof. We know Iraq, there was no proof. It was all lies. Boom, destabilized the region. Same thing with Libya, with Gaddafi. No, when that happened, there's slave markets over there. The US wants that. They will literally kill children for other people's resources. They'll kill your own children and get something out of it. And the fact that you don't believe that is more shocking than anything else.
In 2009, President Barack Obama became the first Black American president of the United States. Both the blacks in the US and in Africa were excited at the notion of his presidency. However, for Africans, President Obama's administration turned out to be the worst in regard to its African policy. Before Obama became president, Libya had been flourishing under the leadership of Muammar Gaddafi. However, by the time Obama finished his term, Libya had descended into chaos, all thanks to Obama and his vice Hillary Clinton. In March 2011, under the pretext of protecting civilians from Gaddafi's dictatorial rule, the Obama administration bombed Libya into oblivion while using racist and terrorist rebel groups to do their dirty deeds on the ground. They used the same terrorists that targeted Africans for rape, torture, and public lynchings, simply because they were seen as allies to Muammar Gaddafi. Despite the fact that there was no credible evidence to support their accusations against Gaddafi, particularly the claims that he wanted to murder Libyan civilians, Obama ordered NATO to bomb Libya from the air and used the CIA to deliver arms, advice, and even cash to terrorist rebels to overthrow Gaddafi. Unfortunately for Libya, they succeeded. But the truth of Gaddafi's death had absolutely nothing to do with Gaddafi's supposed dictatorial rule. In fact, Gaddafi could be said to be the best leader Libya had. Under his leadership, Libya was the most economically prosperous African country with free healthcare and education. However, the problem was that he was resistant to the United States' neo-colonial machinations with AFRICOM. And knowing that the US dollar was rapidly dropping in value, he wanted the US to purchase oil from Libya in the form of gold. He called for a United States of Africa. He also wanted to rid his country of terrorist groups. However, he was killed and tens of thousands of civilians were killed in the airstrike. Since then, Libya has been in chaos. The country has become a failed state overrun with armed rebels and terrorist groups, some of whom are supported by the US. The chaos led to the emergence of the Libyan slave market, where Africans were openly sold as slaves in the open-air market. The chaos in Libya has been hijacked by terrorist groups which began to spread first to Mali and then to Burkina Faso and Niger. The current instability in the Sahel region is a direct consequence of the instability in Libya. All of this was simply because Obama decided to intervene and kill an African anti-West leader. Besides this, Obama expanded the US AFRICOM's operations, turning into a permanent fixture of the US intervention. Under his administration, tens of thousands of African civilians have been killed by the US military under the guise of fighting terrorism, while the next president did not give Africa too much.
Yeah, hey, that's your black president, right? First black president, huh? Why don't you clap your hands? You voted for him, right? All right, isn't everybody happy? Isn't everybody happy? Oh, he was great. People put his mural up like he's Jesus, you know? There are slave markets in Libya. The US literally funded rapists and didn't bat an eye, didn't feel anything for it. Literally. Oh, you guys give me free healthcare? Hell no, we don't do that. You can't do the same. You gotta go. Yep, that's who we really ally ourselves with.
Attention, there were a couple of his actions that also caused chaos on the continent. We are talking about President Donald Trump's first term. Trump's presidency during his first term was marked by escalating military aggression, open disdain for African countries, and mass civilian casualties. Trump was quite vocal about his disdain for the African continent, which he referred to as shithole countries. But beyond his open hostility, Trump, like his predecessors, engaged in military interventions, particularly in Somalia. He expanded drone warfare, withdrew humanitarian aid, and strengthened the U.S. AFRICOM unchecked military operations. Under Trump's administration, the Pentagon was given looser rules of engagement. This meant that U.S. forces no longer needed to prove that there was an imminent threat before launching airstrikes. This resulted in an increase in civilian casualties as the U.S. carried out over 200 drone strikes in Somalia. This was far more than that of Obama and Bush's administrations combined. According to reports from human rights organizations like Amnesty International, these strikes frequently killed innocents, including women and children. The last president we are going to talk about.
And there goes, it's Orange Jesus, right? Orange Jesus. For all you Christians out there. Yeah. They bombed Somalia where there's nothing, everything's already bombed and destroyed. They're still bombing. They're bombing just sand at this point. I have no problem with it. Now they don't even need immediate threat. They're just like, we just bomb for the sake of bombing now. That's the West. That's the West. That's the Western values. The U.S., baby. You know what? It's probably the Holy Spirit that's telling them to do this. That's why.
About is President Joe Biden. When he first came in, Biden assured African leaders that he would reverse some Trump's damaging policies. But 4 years later, it was clear that nothing changed. Biden reinstated U.S. troops in Somalia, leading to more drone strikes. He also expanded the footprint of the U.S. AFRICOM across the continent. Biden's drone strikes in Somalia have killed both terrorists and civilians. Unfortunately, these strikes have not eliminated the terrorists. The only thing it has succeeded in doing is fueling resentment against the U.S. and destabilizing Somalia. Biden has also maintained support for authoritarian regimes in Africa, provided that they granted something in exchange.
Obviously.
With all this, it is pretty clear that the authorities in the U.S. are no different from the colonial leaders of Europe. Like Europe, the U.S. has also contributed its own share of creating chaos and destabilization in Africa. It's no wonder then that some African leaders have begun to ditch the West in favor of non-Western countries like Russia. This is because it has become apparent that the U.S. is no better. What are your thoughts?
I guess it's pretty clear already now. Like, if you're still in this denial of not believing that this is the U.S. or the U.S. is not evil, it's everybody else. Oh, it's the evil Russia and all those people. I mean, you got to be living under a rock or something. I mean, at this point, it's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious that this is what the U.S. always been. It's what the West always been. You know, they like and enjoy suppressing others, making them their slaves, and using them for their own, reasons, resources, and such. That's what it's all about. So let me know what you guys think. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Till next time.